World History Lesson 2. In this lesson, we are going to discuss early civilizations in ancient Egypt. Our lesson objectives are: explain the influence of geography on development in the ancient world, identify the social classes and structure of ancient Egypt, identify the characteristics and contributions of civilizations in ancient Egypt and other early civilizations. River Valley Civilization. New Stone Age people that lived along the Nile learned to farm crops and raise cattle. From this simple beginning, one of the world's first great civilizations developed. Egypt, also known as the Gift of the Nile, would become one of the greatest cultural centers the world has ever seen. The multicultural Egyptian civilization was very advanced and lasted almost 3,100 years. Many of their monuments and ideas are preserved and still with us today. Egypt has a very dry climate and 9/10 of the land is desert. Almost the entire population lives along the Nile River, where the land is fertile and able to support settlements. Ancient Egypt was divided into two regions, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Around 3100 BC, a king named Menes united the two regions into one kingdom. The kingdom created by Menes lasted long after his death. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt passed from father to son for many years. This period is called the Old Kingdom, and it lasted roughly from 2660 BC to 2180 BC. During this time, the first pyramids were built as tombs for pharaohs. Scribes became responsible for keeping records of notable events. Cities grew and people began to use metal for many different things, such as metals or tools. Egyptians were one of the first peoples to establish a lasting system of government and social order. Government during the Old Kingdom eventually grew corrupt, and local leaders fought among themselves for power and wealth. Civil war erupted, and this ended the Old Kingdom. The decline of the Old Kingdom lasted about 100 years. The next group of kings who ruled Egypt established the Middle Kingdom. The new pharaohs made Egypt strong and prosperous. Early civilizations in ancient Egypt. During the period from about 2080 BC to 1640 BC, life improved, but the corruption remained in government. Due to the lack of able leadership, conditions were ripe for invasion. Conflicts between squabbling kings, priests, and nobles made Egypt weak. About 1640 BC, Egypt was invaded and conquered by tribes from the northeast known as Hyksos. The Hyksos treated the Egyptian people cruelly. The Hyksos ruled Egypt for about 70 years, and around 1570 BC, Egyptians threw out the invaders. Driving out the Hyksos marked the beginning of Egypt's new kingdom. This was a great period for Egypt. The new kingdom established an empire when Egypt invaded and conquered the neighboring territories. Egyptian rule now extended far beyond the Nile River Valley and into Western Asia. Vast trade routes between Egypt and its empire grew strong. As a result, much wealth flowed into Egypt and huge temples and monuments were built. Life in ancient Egypt. At first, most people in Egypt lived in small towns along the Nile River. A few urban centers emerged when Egypt was united in the Old Kingdom. The largest urban centers were Thebes, Memphis, and Heliopolis, all of which became major seats of government, culture, and religion. One of the first systems of law was created in ancient Egypt. The law in ancient Egypt was very strict. The punishment of violating the law for minor crimes could include being whipped, tortured, thrown to crocodiles, or sent to labor camps. The common man was little more than a laborer for the privileged classes of priests, landlords, and military leaders. Egyptian society. Egyptian society was made up of many social classes. Socially, a very small minority were among the privileged classes. The privileged class included the priests, landlords, government officials, and military leaders. Probably more than 99% of the people were poor. Common people paid huge sums of money in taxes to support the government. The common people enjoyed few privileges. They lived and died for one purpose, and that was to work to support the country. The Egyptian king was called the pharaoh, meaning great house. The pharaoh was the most powerful person in Egypt as he held all of the authority. The people believed that the pharaohs were descended from their gods and ruled as their representative. Many of these rulers were good rulers. The pharaoh appointed officials to assist them in ruling the large kingdom. The pharaohs owned all of the land and appointed landlords to manage vast farmlands. The landlords became powerful in their own villages. Others who held authority were Egyptian priests, government, and military officials. The government officials collected taxes and managed government projects. Scribes were given the task of keeping records for the government, and they kept records for the temples. Some of the people were tradesmen and merchants. They traveled up and down the Nile trading goods produced in each village. This trading of goods without using money is called barter. The vast majority of Egyptians were peasants. Peasants are usually described as members of the lower class. The peasants farmed the land along the Nile River. Women in ancient Egypt could own property and could decide who should get it when they died. However, women in the royal family sometimes had to marry relatives. For instance, the pharaoh had to marry someone who was his equal and would therefore sometimes have to marry a relative. Significance of the Nile River. The Nile is the world's longest river that flows north for about 4,000 miles. The Nile River was and still is the backbone of Egypt. The Nile provides water, fertile land, and a transportation system. However, it also caused great problems. Each year around April, the Nile began to flood and reached its peak in July and was usually over by October. While flooding killed many people, ruined farmland, and destroyed homes, the Egyptians learned to cope with it. The Egyptians quickly realized that the floodwaters of the Nile left behind a layer of very fertile topsoil, which was very important for productive farming. The Egyptians also learned that by digging canals and draining swamps, they could save their precious land. The Egyptians began draining swamps, which increased food production on land that would have otherwise been wasted. This also served as disease prevention by killing off disease-carrying mosquitoes. Egyptian religion. Ancient Egyptians were polytheistic or believed in many gods. The Egyptians were also led to believe that the pharaoh was like a god. Symbols and figures were created to represent the gods. People believed that everything which affected their lives was a result of the god's actions. The sun god, Re, and the goddess of nature and motherhood, Isis, were the most powerful gods. Queen Nefertiti was the wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten. He ruled Egypt from 1375 to 1358 BC. Amun was a god of air, wind, and the breath of life, and many huge temples were dedicated to him. The Egyptians' religion included as a belief in life after death, so they learned to preserve dead bodies through embalming so that they would be ready for the next life. The preserved body was known as a mummy. Some mummies, like that of Tutankhamun, known as King Tut, can be seen today. Some historians believe that mummies remained well preserved over the centuries, were aided by Egypt's exceptionally dry climate. The pharaohs built large four-sided tombs called pyramids to protect the mummies. Along with the mummified body, many possessions were placed inside the tombs of the pyramids. This was done to please the gods and make life after death as comfortable as possible. About 80 pyramids were built in the Valley of Giza. The largest pyramid, called the Great Pyramid, was built by Khufu, a pharaoh of the Old Kingdom. The Great Pyramid of Giza is considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. All of the work on the Great Pyramid was done by human labor using only the crudest of tools. Stone used for the tomb chamber inside the pyramid came from 700 miles away. Men cut the rocks, formed them into blocks, brought them by boat up the Nile, probably dragged them across the desert, and used ramps to put them in the correct position on the pyramid. Egyptian contributions. During the periods of Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, which spanned almost 2,000 years, the Egyptian civilization produced a great deal for future generations. Some of these achievements include great architecture and engineering feats, such as the pyramids and the Sphinx, and the use of mathematics, particularly geometry. Egyptian doctors studied the human body, diseases, and performed surgery. By dissection of the human body, they learned how body parts worked and taught them how to splint broken bones. Egyptian scientists studied the stars and learned to measure time. The Egyptians also created a calendar system much like the one we use today. The calendar was extremely important as it allowed the Egyptians to know when to plant crops to avoid freezes and when to expect the floods of the Nile River. Written records of these discoveries were kept. They devised a kind of writing called hieroglyphics, where pictures or symbols stood for words. They also developed a kind of paper called papyrus, named for the plant it was made from. Our word for paper comes from the Egyptian word papyrus. Fun fact. Normally, hieroglyphics are read from right to left. However, there are some instances where they are read from left to right. Human and animal forms in the hieroglyphics always look to the beginning of the text, indicating from which direction to begin reading. Hieroglyphs are used only when they are carved into stone. When written on paper, it is properly called hieratic, presented in a form of cursive writing. Other early civilizations. Around the same time that the Egyptian civilization was flourishing in the Nile River Valley, other river valleys around the world were developing civilizations as well. Two early civilizations, Japan and Amerindian, did not develop along river valleys. Each of the early civilizations developed and achieved greatness in self-contained geographical areas. That means all early civilizations were surrounded by natural barriers such as deserts, mountains, and oceans. This allowed early civilizations to grow and develop in relative peace and stability. What's next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite a source in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation. This includes the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. The URL citationmachine.net will assist you in creating citations.